Game Breaker TV.
Hello everybody and welcome to a special episode of Legendary. This is episode 140. You're watching Game Breaker TV. I'm your host, Mike Schaffnitz. Today, we've got an extra special treat for you guys, but first, before we get into it, joining us from Gamescom, all the way out in Germany, it's the one, WoW Insider's Olivia D. Grace.
Hello there, from Germany.
How's it going?
Guten Abend von Deutschland.
I don't understand a word of that.
That was good afternoon from Germany.
And from Convert to Raid headquarters, Mr. Pat Crane, aka Zug.
Hello.
Hello. How's it going, man?
It's going well. It's kind of weird to be doing this in the middle of the day, but
it is.
I'm ready for it.
All right. I know it's the sun's out. I'm gonna get to go home and actually have like daylight. And we've got two special guest hosts joining us today. Joining us for Legendary 140, lead system designer Greg Streets, aka Ghostcrawler, and lead encounter designer Ian Hazzikostas, aka Watcher. What's up, guys?
Hey, not too much. Great to be here.
Great to have you on. We're super happy to have you on, and we really appreciate it. So we got a short amount of time, so we're just going to jump right into it. We're going to try and get to as many questions as we can. And again, just thanks for being on the show. So first up, I'll start this off. Obviously, this is my speculation here. The media has been abuzz pretty much since we all found that mysterious trademark for the Dark Below. Could you guys? I mean, come on. It's kind of ironic that shortly after Blizzard trademark Corgis Unleashed, I think you guys filed an extra trademark to throw us off the scent. Can you guys give us any insight? Anything at all?
My recommendation would be to just make a little bookmark for all these places on the internet that are engaged in the really hot discussion right now, and when we reveal everything, you can go back and look and be like, oh, these guys are right, or holy crap, these guys were so off the mark.
That's all we're gonna get. I think that's all we're gonna get.
All right, I'm gonna cut.
Wild speculation to believe next time. Right.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll look back at this interview and be like, oh, they totally. We'll reinterpret that time and time again to say that you did confirm it or didn't confirm it. That's what's going to happen.
Well, after Tom made the comments about Pandaren for Mr. Pandaria, now every time we deny something, that immediately means it's accurate. So there's nothing you can do with it.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. Your denial is to be a confirmation. All right, let's do some more serious questions. And so dungeons and scenarios have been a really hot topic. We've got a ton of people asking us about these with shows and through the forums. Some people miss the dungeons and quick gearing, and but they like the scenario. Some of the others like the scenarios without the specific roles. How do you see these working together in future patches or expansions? How do you see the two things running alongside each other, particularly for tanks and healers?
I think there's room for both types of content, and we're definitely excited to see how the scenario system has evolved and grown over the course of Mists of Pandaria. I think heroic scenarios are probably one of the more exciting additions. We're really happy with how those have worked out since patch 5.3. The sort of role-agnostic nature of scenarios means that you can just kind of pick up and jump in and play them with your friends right away. We're excited to see that we can make content that doesn't necessarily require you to, queue solo and go with matchmaking. We can say, hey, you have to have at least a couple of friends, and people will do it. Heroic scenarios have been very popular, and it lets us get back to having some more interesting and engaging gameplay, having some mechanics that matter, and I think it opens the door for a lot of exciting potential in the future, both for the scenario system and for the dungeon system as well.
So are you saying that we might be seeing where heroic dungeons are going to become a thing where it's going to be all pre-made groups and not an LFD system, or are you going to be planning on doing this for other aspects within the game?
I don't know that we'd go that far with existing systems, because I think there's a certain expectation when we have type of content that's already been out there, people are in the habit of being able to log on and queue for it. If we suddenly say, you can't do this anymore. Your gameplay behavior that you're accustomed to once you log in, once we push whatever patch, you can no longer do. That can be kind of off-putting. But it lets us potentially explore expanding that type of content, because we definitely would like to get back to a place where mechanics do matter a bit more in some of our small group content, because we know there's a huge audience for that type of cooperation. That's really a lot of that core MMO gameplay where you're learning and overcoming a challenge with a small group of friends, and maybe things like crowd control matter, maybe things like using your interrupts in a timely way matter. And as we saw in Cataclysm, it can be frustrating trying to combine that gameplay with completely random groups that don't really have much filtering or screening going into them. So it's something that we think about, something that we discuss, and a lot of exciting potential for the future.
Fantastic. And speaking of going forward with this, you've got the Siege of Orgrimmar releasing obviously in about 2 weeks' time, and maybe actually 2.5. And then the next expansion, we don't know it's being announced at BlizzCon, but we're kind of presuming it's going to be announced at BlizzCon. Are you guys planning anything to avoid a Dragon Soul style 8 months of Siege of Orgrimmar, bearing in mind the Mists of Pandaria beta was 6 months? So are we looking at a 5.5 patch or maybe a shorter beta for the next expansion?
I think, in terms of our timetables, as always, future content will be released when it's ready. But we may have some additional content that comes between 5.4 and whatever larger chunk comes after that. But as always, I think the best thing that we can do for our players is to work as hard as we can and get exciting, high-quality content into their hands as quickly as possible. But in the meantime, 14 bosses in Siege of Orgrimmar, 5 world bosses, so on and so forth. There's no lack of content here.
Very true.
Now, what about the fact that obviously we've seen kind of what you guys are doing with hunters in regards to button bloat, and that's probably due to just the age of the game. You want to introduce new and fun, exciting abilities with every new expansion. But obviously you run into the problem, and we're seeing it now with hunters where you're starting to take away the button bloat. Is this something that you guys are looking to do with more classes? And if so, which ones?
Yeah, there are two competing forces at work here. On the one hand, simplifying some of the it's not necessarily the rotations, but like you point out, just the excessive number of buttons that some of the classes have is definitely a goal. On the other hand, too much class change can also be bad for the game. And we know that for everyone who's excited about, now I don't have to worry about readiness, we know there are players out there that are going to miss readiness and are disappointed to see it go away. So as we went into Mist, we actually did prune a lot of abilities, and we gradually added a few back based on, I'm thinking of Divine Favor for Holy Paladins is one of those that we added kind of back late because there was an outcry and players really missed it, and it was, a legitimate concern. So I would say for the future, we'll take another pass at it. We'll try to figure out what is kind of the cruft that the classes don't really need anymore. I'd say one of the mistakes we made in Mist was we pruned abilities that were very situational or even fun abilities. The Eyes of the Beast is a great example of one that doesn't really hurt players' keybinds, or it's not going to be in a critical spot in your action bar, but we did get rid of it, and now players kind of miss it. So I don't think that's a great example of the kind of things to get rid of. Maybe there are more situational abilities that we can find across the classes.
Real quick, does button bloat, personally, I think a lot of people feel like button bloat comes from a lot of trying to equalize abilities across all classes. Obviously, you run into a risk of needing to give an extra button to another class so that, you guys could make 10 mans a little bit easier so that you have a little bit of everything. Do you think that comes from just overextending in terms of how much to give certain abilities to every class?
Yeah, definitely. I think, there's a few things that go into it. I think it was Olivia maybe last week said, we've probably been a little too nice to players when they say, oh, I have to have this ability to compete. And maybe we can hold the line a little bit more and things like that. We gave Paladins a interrupt, a kick/pummel analog that didn't exist a few expansions ago. And they felt like, they deserve one. How are they going to do challenging 5-player, 10-player content without an interrupt? But maybe not every class needs an interrupt. Maybe not every class needs a disarm or a silence or things like that. So that's one category. Another one is every time we expand the level cap for World of Warcraft, we feel like we owe players some new buttons. It would be kind of lame to go 5 levels without getting a new ability or two. And so we get things like the symbiosis of the world get added because druids have to have something. What are we possibly going to give druids at all?
I love it, by the way. That was awesome.
Everything's
awesome.
So I think camping down on both of those areas a little bit will help, as well as just looking across the board. Like one of the things that's kind of on my radar right now is the base heal spell that all the healers have that you're kind of supposed to use until you gear out of that and have better regen and better throughput. And maybe those spells just don't have a great role in the game anymore. You know, they're kind of situational once you get out of greens and blues. So, I mean, that's just not announcing that as a change. That's the kind of category of things we'll look at.
Not an announcement. And speaking of actually, not an announcement. That Twitter hashtag does not work, Greg.
No.
You can hashtag that all you like. It's not going to work.
I don't think any of my Twitter hashtags work.
Unfortunately not. Speaking of healing and actually class changes, is there any plan? I remember a little while back there were these talk of particularly kind of PvP specific nerfs to instant cast heals, but more specifically at the time the blanket silence changes. That was something which we said at the time was more something fitting for an expansion rather than a patch that would be too hard for people to adjust to midway through an expansion. Is there any interest in bringing those changes back in or making similar changes along those lines with instant casts and blankets?
Oh, definitely. At the time, we tried to just get rid of a lot of the silences, and what we found is like, oh, now nobody can stop the healers because without the silences, they just cast a lot of fast instant spells. It's just been an arms race there. As classes get better at countering the heals, we've given the healers more instant or hard-to-counter spells, and then we have to counter those with even stronger silences, and we just need to, you know, back down the entire thing. But that's a big change. It would have a lot of ramifications for people running dungeons, for raids, as well as PvP. So we're going to take another crack at it next time we get a chance. It's not going to be as extreme as instant heals are now dead. We just want to make sure that everyone has to cast once in a while, because then it rewards the skill of actually, you know, juking or interrupting or doing the right thing there.
But that's why I play a druid healer. Come on. Let's go.
Run around hot. Run around hot. So I'm going to jump while I heal.
I'm the only guy in my raid team. I'm the only guy in my raid team that loves Tortos. By the way, so just letting you know. Speaking of raiding, let's get back into Siege of Orgrimmar a little bit, and I want to find out from you guys what kind of encounters that you're looking at where you really want to see how players react to some of the mechanics that you have coming up. What are going to be those key mechanics that you're really looking for to see how players interact?
My glib answer would be all of them. But I mean,
I know you have a favorite, Ian. I know it.
It's like asking for the favorite child. It's hard. But I think we have a few encounters that have some interesting class-specific mechanics. The third encounter in Siege of Orgrimmar, Norushen, has like an almost proving grounds-esque component to it. The idea is that before this Titan Keeper will let you in to face the Shah of Pride, you need to prove to him that you're not corrupt, because people are naturally full of pride and prone to corruption, so you need to purify yourselves. And the way you do that over the course of the fight is for individual players to go in and complete separate trials that are specific to their role. So damage dealers, healers, tanks each have a separate variant in what they have to do. Once they successfully complete it, they come out cleansed and are able to do full damage and additional damage to the boss that they're fighting. So that's definitely going to be a very, a type of challenge that utilizes a broader variety of class abilities and mechanics than you may see in a typical raid encounter, and should be fun.
Are we going to see more fights where kind of individual responsibility becomes a part of the key aspect to completing the fight?
I think that's something that we always try to incorporate to an extent. I mean, obviously it depends on our tuning and the target audience, what the difficulty is. Is it, one of the last bosses on Heroic? Is it an earlier boss on Normal or Flexible? And that's going to determine the answer to that question on a certain level. It's important in a raid that players feel like their actions matter, that they're not just kind of cogs in a machine. At the same time, you definitely can push individual responsibility too far. If a single individual's failure can wipe the entire raid, then suddenly you have many different failure points, and an individual player who's doing well can feel like they're not going to win until every single person in the raid masters some individual check. And that's been frustrating in some fights in the past, like Heroic Dark Animus or something like Thaddeus, if you really want to go far back. So we need to be careful about how far we push that. Ideally, it's the kind of thing where sometimes a raid leader can choose their stronger players who are more comfortable with that responsibility to handle the higher individual responsibility mechanics. But again, it varies.
So some of the encounters, most notably, I think a lot of people are concerned about Paragons of the Klaxi, almost having mechanic overload. Do you guys think this is going to be a problem with future encounters or other fights?
It's definitely a challenge, and it's something that we've talked about a lot. I think in some ways our dungeon journal can actively be counterproductive in that regard. if you look at the dungeon journal for Paragons of the Claxi, your head will probably explode, and rightly so.
Yeah, it did.
There are a lot of bosses with a bunch of abilities. I think you could say the same thing about a fight like Horadon in Throne of Thunder, though. If you actually open the dungeon journal for that fight, holy crap, there are a lot of abilities. It's 4 gates, each of which has 2 or 3 distinct types of adds, each of which has 1 or 2 abilities. Then you have the boss, then you have the other guy that jumps down later on, who also has a couple of abilities. It's a lot. If you try to look at that and strategize or figure out how you're going to approach the fight coming into it, you're going to have a hard time. However, I think when you actually go through the experience of working on and learning Horadon, you're dealing with it 1 gate at a time, and it doesn't actually feel too overwhelming, because you're just seeing 3 or 4 things at a time, 1 or 2 of which at most are really of critical importance. Paragons of the Claxi actually has the same type of flow to it. You only fight 3 of the 9 at a time, and each of them has 2 or even 1 ability in many cases. So I think you're going through it, learning it piece by piece, and by the time you're getting to the 7th or 8th one in line, you've long since completely internalized and mastered the first few mechanics.
Gotcha. Now, speaking of mechanics, how do you keep mechanics fresh over time? I mean, we've been through a ton of different raid instances now. We've had, going way back. I think we've experienced them all, and yet you guys keep on coming up with new stuff or reinventing some classic moves. How do you keep that fresh?
I think a mix of, combining some of the tried and true puzzle pieces in new ways that haven't necessarily been seen before. Some of it is dressing up old mechanics in different ways. I mean, on some level, many mechanics have the appropriate response of spread out or avoid this thing on the ground. But depending on the nature of the boss that you're fighting, the spell visuals associated with it, the consequences for failure or success, it can feel quite different. And then on top of all of that, we occasionally do just throw a wrench in things and come up with something completely new, often with the assistance of new technical capabilities, like the movement forces that we've begun to be able to introduce on various fights throughout Mists of Pandaria, from Lei Shi on to Lei Shen and onward.
Absolutely. No, so moving on to something a little bit different. Brian Holinka tweeted a little while back that was going to be some kind of revamp happening with PvP gear in 6.0. We've seen a couple of blue posts kind of talking about the prevalence of PvE gear in PvP, particularly in the world. And it kind of seems to indicate that Blizzard are aware of some of the issues with gear at the moment, and the sheer quantity of item levels and the lack of a clear gearing path seems to be a little bit tricky right now. Are you planning any kind of changes to gear in 6.0? Are you trying to sort of compact things down a bit, or?
Yeah,
like
the problem we were trying to fix with changing the PvP gear item levels was to make sure that new players could get in, because to get all the way up to like the really competitive Conquest gear was a long grind, and when you had been away from the game a little bit, or God forbid you wanted to switch your main that you were playing, players are telling us, I just can't compete, and I just get destroyed all the time until I get the decent item levels. So we really liked the compression worked really good for that. It did create 2 other problems. The first is that while if we have to choose between world PvP and organized PvP, we want a really good experience in organized PvP. But I do think it's fair that this time it came at the expense of world PvP. And we want that to feel like a better experience, that the PvP players in their PvP gear feel like they can be out there and compete. The other problem I think it has is more psychological. Just when you're a gladiator level player and you look at your item level, and then you look at a guy who went to a heroic raid and see the item level differences, like, yeah, deep down that PvP power and things like that make a difference, but it feels like the message we're sending is that you're not as important, and that's absolutely not the message we want to send. So we're still in the middle of figuring out how to fix that system, but those are the goals, to make sure that you can get the best gear for PvP and PvP, you can get the best gear for PvE and PvE, that a little bit of crossover is fine. If you're a heroic raider and you want to do some PvP, you can get in the door and you're not going to get destroyed, but no, high-end PvP player is going to feel like, well, time to go get that trinket off that one boss, or I won't be able to play anymore. So that's the goal. Hopefully we'll come up with a system that everyone will be excited about.
So now, obviously, speaking of PvP, though, Olivia and I always constantly argue about this. But since we have it here, I figure we can ask about the crowd chose you. I think with this buff, we're seeing a lot of people on the PTR kind of change the way that they play their arena matches. Is this intended? And if it wasn't intended, how do you guys plan on kind of changing that?
No, it's not really intended. The entire goal of that feature was to shut down the really long, drawn-out fights in kind of a reasonable way. We don't really want players to change the strategy or tactics based on the existence of that element that's supposed to come in, right at the end. And if we think it's having a detrimental effect overall, we'll chill it out or just remove it or something like that. We really only wanted to stop the super long matches where people are like, well, if I wait 5 more minutes, my cooldown will come up again, and things like that. It just, at some point it's not fun for the fights to go on that long.
But it's so much fun for the troll.
It is fun for the troll, that is true.
I've been on that side. All right, so what was your idea kind of behind the riposte mechanic for Protection Warriors and Blood Death Knights? Is this kind of a way to make avoidance more attractive for tanking gear?
I would say in the short term. I mean, avoidance is one of those stats that's been on tanking gear forever, particularly when there was only one tank, and then when there were kind of 2 plate tanks. What's happened in the meantime is I feel like we were pretty successful with the active mitigation mechanic that we tried to give all of the tanks, and it worked so well in some cases that the big example is haste for protection paladins became a pretty attractive stat, not only for DPS but also for active mitigation. And warriors and DKs just didn't have a mechanic that played in quite so well. So whereas the paladin could reforge or even look for gear with haste, the paladin, the warrior and DK are going to have to deal with the dodge and parry that were going to be on their gear anyway because they are, they're tanking tier sets if nothing else. So the riposte was a way to try to convert those avoidance mechanics into something that would play back into their active mitigation. And I feel like we've been pretty open with the fact that there may not be a good long-term role for dodge and parry as stats on gear. They're still cool mechanics, and you can imagine a world where tanks still dodge a lot because that's something that helps them avoid damage, but they're not gearing for it, so to speak.
Also in the short term, just from an encounter balance perspective in terms of the different tank classes, it helps equalize tank damage output somewhat, because monks and druids, due to the nature of their gearing, just naturally get crit and haste and mastery, which has the secondary benefit of increasing their damage and throughput, whereas plate tanks just didn't have as many offensive stats available to them, and so over time their damage tended to lag behind a little bit. This lets us equalize that a bit more.
Cool. All right, well, I'll switch it up a little bit, and let's talk about the People's Legendary Cloak. Now, how do you guys feel that the Legendary has done this expansion? Is this something that you may repeat in the future, or do you think that there's some modifications that are needed to the process that you just did for this time around?
I think it's definitely something that we're happy with, though we've certainly learned lessons as we've gone. It definitely hit, our vision here from the start was an epic quest line that really spanned the entirety of the expansion, from your first introduction to Wrathion when you hit level 90 for the very first time last fall and went to visit him in his inn, and he set you on this minor task, then has now since then turned into something that's taken you across the world into multiple different raid zones, to the Celestials' temples, and so on and so forth, and is finally going to culminate in receiving a Legendary Cloak. Along the way, obviously, there have been these other rewards. And I think it's been nice to have these big picture goals that guide players, in addition to the more structured goals of a raiding guild that's just trying to kill the next boss or improve their progression rankings on their server. Every individual always had something to work towards that was going to benefit their character in a meaningful way. At the same time, we've also recognized that part of the trade-off of having this long quest chain feel meaningful is that people who have fallen behind, either because they are just coming to the game now or because they're switching to an alt, may feel like they've fallen behind and need to catch up. So we've offered some catch-up mechanisms to make it easier to get to the current spot in the Legendary quest chain, but at the same time, we don't want to trivialize that. We don't want to make people who put in the time and effort to get all their Secrets of the Empire and Titan Runestones and all of that feel like they were silly for just not waiting until 5.4 when we just handed it to you. So striking the balance there has been challenging. Making it feel like it's rewarding without making people who are behind feel bad. But I think it's something that we're likely to continue to explore and expand on in the future as a system in general.
Cool.
So, Greg, actually, you tweeted about the Legendary Cloak and how you might look towards doing something more exclusive with it in the future. Is that something that you guys are looking at as well, or are you not really? You're planning to keep it going down this path of getting it for everybody?
I'm trying to remember the exact context of the tweet. Probably what I was talking about was back in the day of, say, Warglaives, they were fairly rare, and some people got them and some people didn't. The system, because the RNG was kind of frustrating, the system we went to was one where rogues and mages and balanced druids or anyone else who had Terragos's Wrath could kind of look at the calendar of, okay, guys, 5 weeks from now I'm going to have enough drops, and then I'm going to get my legendary item. And it kind of had a feeling of entitlement and inevitability, which was kind of at odds with the feeling of I got my legendary. So not sure yet exactly how we'll handle legendary weapons in the future. My guess would be it would be something more old school WoW and less like we did in the Cataclysm expansion. Like Ian said, the cloaks were a fun thing to try. We may do something like that again, but overall, one of the things we really owe players in the game is to keep rewards fresh. And we're always going to have set bonuses. Set bonuses are cool. You're always going to get better gear as you level up, but we want to make sure that the systems don't become too predictable, because that just makes every tier of content that we come out feel just like all the others. We don't want to be too predictable, because we think that contributes to the game getting stale.
For sure. Okay, let's changing it up a little bit again. We're kind of all over the place with these questions. Speaking of the connected realms, and we've heard a bit more about these now. How will this new feature be rolled out? I mean, what can we expect specifically in regard to population sizes? And do we know yet whether we're going to be able to transfer things like heirlooms and other bind on account items within these connected realm clusters?
So we have targets there. The targets are kind of like what an average to full realm would feel like. We don't want everyone out there to suddenly hit long queues. That's not cool either. We do want to provide enough players out there to where you're in the shrines and you see other players around. And hopefully we get a lot of pug flex mode raids going on. So we want to make sure there's enough people, even though those are cross-realm. Want to make sure you see enough players around that even in trade chat you can start to put those groups together. So the way we want to make sure all the technology is in place, and we will probably connect some realms pretty quickly once 5.4 rolls out. But we didn't want players to think that day one when they log in, all of a sudden everything's different. We need to make sure that things are stable, that we don't stumble upon any unexpected technical or gameplay problems, and then we'll expand it quickly to make sure that all of those realms get kind of the targets we want.
And then in terms of the other half of the question, in terms of things like heirlooms, all of that, for all intents and purposes, will behave as though it's just a single regular server. So anything that you can do currently with someone who is on your same server, you'll be able to do with someone who's in a connected realm with you. The connected realm really is a system that's more to ease any confusion. No one's going to have to change their names. Someone who's returning after a few months to the game isn't going to find their realm suddenly missing from the realm list. They'll just log on to the same server name, same character name that was there before. It's just now you'll see more people running around, but you'll be able to trade with them, form a guild with them, do whatever you currently could with someone that's regularly on your realm.
So perfect. There's a very special technical consideration of the player that is on a connected realm and has characters spread across two realms that are now connected, and what rule sets apply to them, because normally they wouldn't be able to pass things like heirlooms across. And we don't know yet exactly how that's going to work. My guess is that, as Ian said, it'll just feel like a realm, which means if you had multiple characters, you would be able to pass things back and forth. Now, on the other hand, that's not really why we wanted to instigate connected realms, and we don't want to push players to feel like, oh, well, I need to transfer to connected realm now because I have all these extra benefits of having characters that can pass heirlooms back and forth. So we're just going to have to see how that kind of plays out. We're not trying to be mean to players, but at the same time, we're trying to solve a particular problem here where some of these realms don't have viable populations of players. We're not trying to give lots of other perks through the system.
Right. I'm going to switch it up just one more time, and we're going to talk a little bit about scaling. Now, with all the scaling tools that you have for for all the scaling tools that you guys have now with flex raids and with challenge modes and proving grounds, are you gonna take a look at maybe developing something with older content, older raids, older dungeons, and maybe revisit that for folks that want to go through that, quote unquote, at level?
It's certainly something that we could explore. Our technology has definitely been improving along those lines. I think that we need to make sure that if we do it in a way that really feels right. We certainly don't want to take anything away from players who enjoy soloing old content and going back and doing it now for transmog gear and things like that, because that's a very popular activity. There's also a very big difference, I think, between nostalgia and the reality of what it would mean to run these dungeons and raids on a regular basis as part of some sort of core system. People often think back to, their fond memories of Blackwing Lair or Molten Core or Serpentrine Cavern or whatever. And it can be fun to go to those places occasionally for transmog gear, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it would translate so well in the modern era to have a full group running through there on a regular basis as some part of some sort of actual incentivized activity. But all of that said, we recognize one of the greatest resources that World of Warcraft has, this incredible and rich array and diversity of dungeons and raids and years worth of content. And we'd love to allow players to explore and experience it in as many ways as possible.
So last up here, I think I speak for everyone when I say, why do you guys hate the Alliance so much? No, for obviously everybody feels like Alliance has had a little bit of a slight in story, but I think something that was interesting when we were setting up for this interview the other day that I heard Zarheim talking about, which is kind of interesting. A lot of people even look at the Siege of Orgrimmar trailer and say, well, Horde's in there, why is an Alliance a part of it? But they made a really kind of interesting comment that I don't think a lot of people thought about. Garrosh isn't really the Horde anymore. He's kind of his own third faction at this point. So really, it's just the Pandaren and the third faction. So is it? What do you guys think about everybody's kind of comments about the Alliance taking a back seat in comparison to the Horde the past couple expansions?
I mean, it's tricky. I think it's a lot of it is subjective. On the one hand, certainly it's a storyline that involves a major Horde figure, the current and former war chief of the Horde, and he's sitting in Orgrimmar right now. But at the same time, the flip side of it is that if you're Alliance, you actually get to invade and pillage through Orgrimmar, and you are killing major Horde faction leaders that you've known as Horde faction leaders for years. And I think the Alliance comes away from this with a victory. We've worked to make sure that the expansion ends, as players will see, on something of a high note for the Alliance. And the full story there has not yet been told, and there is a bit more to be revealed. As we were creating the raid, we also took a lot of opportunities to work in interesting cameos and give players a chance to fight alongside their faction leaders and notable characters. So you get to fight alongside Jaina and Varian. If you're Alliance and only Alliance have this experience, High King Mekatork will come in and steamroll through a large chunk of Garrosh's troops that are in the barracks section of the raid. If you're Horde, you actually have to fight through those. But if you're Alliance, Mekatork does it for you. So little things like that remind players that really they're here alongside the greatest heroes of their faction, and they're working on behalf of the Alliance in that case to achieve this greater victory.
So last up, I know I already said last up, but I'm just gonna do one last question for you guys. Obviously, we've been spending many hours here at Gamebreaker playing Hearthstone. It's another word I can't say properly when I'm speaking too fast. If you guys, but how much have you guys been playing since its launch? I mean, I imagine all across Blizzard, everybody is absolutely just ecstatic about its beta launch.
It's been really exciting. Yeah, I mean, we've been fortunate enough to be able to play the game from earlier internal alphas onwards, and it's been particularly exciting from our perspective, just seeing the world now get to experience the joy and the fun that we've been having with it for months now.
All right, well, if you guys haven't heard, obviously Hearthstone beta opened last Friday, and we here at Gamebreaker have been having a blast. We also just launched a brand new all-encompassing Hearthstone website called Hearth Nation, so if you guys get a chance, please check out hearthnation.com and make sure to keep an eye on the site because we will also be giving away keys. Can't say how much, can't say when, but we will have keys to give away, so head on over there and check that site out. Greg and Ian, thank you guys so much for this opportunity. And Zarheim, not Zarheim.
Zarheim.
No,
another word that I just can't seem to say.
Don't encourage it. Zarheim.
Right.
Thank you so much to Zarheim for...
What's the only way to pronounce it? Zarheim is the only way to pronounce it according to lore.
It's the only way. I blame lore. That's where I picked it up. It was lore. He was the one who drilled that into my head.
That's right.
But thank you so much, Zarheim, for giving us this opportunity. Greg, Ian, again, thank you guys so much for coming on the show.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Huge shout out to the Gamebreaker Nation team. Thank you, everyone. And if you guys haven't checked out Legendary goes live typically Thursdays at 8 p.m. PDT, where we do a weekly podcast where we talk about all things World of Warcraft. So be sure to check that out right here on Gamebreaker TV. Everyone, thank you so much for watching. We'll see you guys next week.